I did it! I'm finally done reading A Brief History of Seven Killings. It took me ages to get through this one. Not because I could never bring myself to pick it up, on the contrary. I just had very limited reading time during the last 3 weeks or so. And this is simply not a book that you can just breeze through. It demands to be read slowly. This is first and foremost because it is written so realistically, in that all the point of view characters, all the first person narrators, only ever reference events and persons with which they are familiar and that are self-explanatory to them in the barest possible way. There is no as you know going on in here, and the narration also always jumps very realistically from thought to thought, and you have to pay close attention in order to be able to keep up, because if you miss one step along the way, you'll be quickly completely lost, especially if, like me, you're not very familiar with Jamaican politics and history. I mean, I didn't even know that Bob Marley was such a controversial character. I liked to listen to his music when I was younger, and I've recently rediscovered him, but that's about it. And I have also recently finished a book that I've been reading on and off for almost a year now, and which incidentally goes alongside A Brief History of Seven Killings very nicely, and that is Trainspotting by Irvine Welsh. This might come as a bit of a surprise that I lump these two books together, but they share a very important common trait, and that is that they both have their characters consistently speak in their own vernacular. In the case of A Brief History of Seven Killings, that is, of course, Jamaican Patois, although I do think it is a somewhat simplified version that is understandable for the average reader. Trainspotting is a bit of a different case, and the title of this video isn't strictly speaking correct when it calls the language in Trainspotting Patois, because what is going on in here is that Irvine Welsh uses non-standard orthography to render the phonetic characteristics of the Scottish dialect and accent. But apart from the phonetic differences and a certain percentage of the vocabulary that contains words from Scots and the Gaelic, the Scottish dialect, unlike the Jamaican Patois, is grammatically still more or less the Queen's English. Neither Irvine Welsh nor Marlon James are, of course, the very first authors to ever use any vernacular or patois in any of their books. But in most cases that happens, it isn't used consistently, and it is confined to either direct speech or to certain marginal characters, and it is often used to mark these characters as other. So by using the vernacular consistently, both Irvine Welsh and Marlon James certainly took a risk. I've heard Marlon James say that this approach is very controversial, especially in Jamaica, because Jamaicans are concerned that it makes them look bad and dumb to the public. And of course, the Scottish dialect has for some reason always been the butt of the joke, hasn't it? So, Trainspotting. The reason it took me so long to read this is because I read it almost like a short story collection, because it is very episodic, and apart from the characters, there isn't much holding it together. And I'm sure most of you will be familiar with the film, and the film does a spectacular job of filtering a story out of this, which I didn't always see or wouldn't have seen if I didn't know the film. If you're not familiar with the story, with what story there is, it is simply about an assortment of characters from working class Edinburgh, and about their heroin addiction and how they are trying and failing to come off it, or how they are not even trying in the first place. And some of them are petty criminals, some aren't, and some of them are more than just petty criminals, and everything is just plain awful, but also in a way very amusing in its grotesqueness. If you've seen the film, you'll know what I mean. I do applaud the book for its realism. I just think that it hasn't aged very well, in the sense that and I'm sure a lot of people my age and younger, grew up watching and reading realistic depictions of drug addiction left and right. So this doesn't hold the same shock value nowadays as it did back when it was first published in the early 90s. Sorry, should have looked that up. Yes, in 1993. So once the novelty of the language of the phonetic rendition of the dialect wore off, there wasn't that much to keep me interested, to be honest. As for the language itself, I have to say it didn't actually always feel that genuine and realistic after all. Some of the time it often felt a bit stilted, and also on every other page there were sudden outbursts of eloquence which didn't seem to be in accordance with the character voice at all. All in all, I have to say I was quite underwhelmed by the reading experience of this one. And if you know neither the book nor the film, I'd suggest that you go watch the film, which is really, really good, and maybe give this book a pass, because I found it just work, no play. A Brief History of 7 Killings, by contrast, made it into the list of my favorite books of all time within 20 pages, if that much, and it has stayed there. This is a book about the social and political state of Jamaica in the 1970s and 1980s. The narrative centers around the attempted assassination of Bob Marley in his house in December 1976. The assassins were never caught or identified, and the characters in this book are all fictitious, although based on real people, I understand. It is an assortment of people, 11 viewpoint characters if I have counted correctly, who are all in some way directly or indirectly more or less closely connected to the incident. We have the gang leader and ghetto lord who just wants to keep his people alive and to keep the upper hand in the war against the ghetto across the street. We have his deputy who has ambitions of his own. We have a couple of ghetto boys who are radicalized after they were brutalized by the police as well as by members of their own peer group. There is the American Rolling Stone reporter who finds himself in too deep but doesn't even recognize it, full of himself and stupid white male that he is. There is the CIA, whose part in the assassination attempt has never become fully clear. And then there is the Jamaican woman Nina, who only wants to get out of the country in order to be able to lead a life in which she doesn't always have to sleep with one eye open, and in which she feels like it isn't just a matter of time when violent crime will find her. This is the story of them all and of the country, and also to some extent world history. It is the story of Jamaican politics and gang culture and how they influence each other and how they affect the average people. And it is about US involvement, or meddling, I should say, in Southern and Central American politics. Each of the 11 viewpoint characters speaks directly to the reader telling their story, and they do so in a very realistic way. And by that I mean ramblingly, meanderingly, and in a very associative fashion, like I mentioned in the beginning, jumping from thought to thought and only ever alluding to events and persons, the way we would talk to a friend or colleague about current issues or persons or shared experiences, where not a lot of words are needed to evoke a whole context of sense and meaning. While that makes it hard to read, it also makes it a very enjoyable read because it is so realistic and it makes the characters really come to life. I find it hard to explain, to get across to you just how rich the reading experience was. I felt like each and every sentence that each of the characters spoke conveyed a whole world of social commentary, and the author was able to do that without ever sacrificing realism or authenticity, and without ever coming across pretentious or preachy, and the characters never seemed like mere sock puppets. It never feels like the typical issue book. It just reads like a very, very, very genuine character portrayal of the kind of characters that we don't often get to hear about in literature. I highly, highly recommend this book to anybody who hasn't yet picked it up, and I'm so glad that this won the Booker Prize in 2015, because without that I don't think that Marlon James would ever have come to my attention in the first place. But I would like to end this short review by saying Marlon James just writes the sexiest sex scenes. I noticed that already in Black Leopard, Red Wolf, but in this book, whoa, take the uncompromising in-your-faceness of Alan Hollinghurst, subtract from the kinkiness and add a good portion of tenderness and cuteness, and you get a Marlon James sex scene. I approve of this very much, although I do understand why his mother isn't allowed to read those pages. And that's all I wanted to tell you for now. Trainspotting and A Brief History of 7 Killings, two very different books who are also very much alike in a certain way. Thanks for watching and have fun reading or watching film adaptations, and I'll see you very soon with another video. Bye!